As much as I love the original Game Boy, I have to admit that it is a hit and miss library. You obviously have some fantastic games that will live on forever, like Super Mario Land 2, Pokemon, and Tetris. On the other hand, you also have some of the worst games ever made like Batman Forever, which is just as bad if not worse than its console counterparts. But then you have some games that are somewhere in between. These games have some things going for them, but a lot of problems that cripple them. Bram Stoker's Dracula, developed by Probe Entertainment, is one of those games for the Game Boy, and I'm going to break down why this game ended up infuriating me by the time I beat it without continues, which I achieved on both emulation and real hardware. I even mastered the game enough to be able to pull off a no-death clear. However, I cannot gloss over the fact that this game has some terrible design choices that ruin what could have been a decent movie-based game. I haven't been this disappointed by such wasted potential in a long time. So where do the problems begin? Right before stage 1. After the intro, you get taken to a screen allowing you to select your difficulty before you begin. That sounds like a normal thing, except that the difficulty here affects how many stages you get. Normally, games try to make enemies more aggressive or do more damage, give you shorter time limits, or add new enemies to the stages on higher difficulties. Now, to be fair, this game does decrease the amount of hit points healed with health pickups, and adds more enemies on higher difficulties. But the main difference in this game is that on easy, you only play the first 4 stages, and on medium, you only play the first 8 stages. So in order to experience all 14 levels of the game, you have to play on hard mode. In what world does that make any sense? Plus, the screen where you choose between the difficulty options makes no attempt to explain any of this. The game doesn't tell you until you've completed easy or medium mode that you need to play it on a higher difficulty to finish the game, which is pretty deceptive if you ask me. But once you start playing, things don't seem so bad at first. For one, the graphics look pretty nice for early Game Boy in terms of the detail in the sprites and the backgrounds. The music, while a bit noisier than your usual soundtrack on Game Boy, fits the mood of the game quite well in my opinion, and I don't mind it. I know some people hate the soundtrack, but I think it works. Overall, the game has a dark, gothic atmosphere that you don't get with a lot of Game Boy titles. Movement and jumping don't seem too bad on first impression. You don't have many enemies in the first few stages, and the first boss fight is pretty easy, so you don't feel like the combat is going to be an issue right away. There are time limits, but the time given to you in those early stages feels more than reasonable. You start out with a little knife with almost no range, but you can grab axes, torches, or rocks to throw in limited quantities from boxes, so you feel like you're getting some help. If you just play this game on easy mode where you only get to play the first 4 stages, you're not going to see the glaring problems with this game. Speaking of stages, now would be a good time to go into the structure of the game. So this game is divided into different areas, with each area having a daytime stage, followed by a nighttime stage. The nighttime stage always has a boss fight at the end of it. So on easy mode, you only get 2 boss fights before it's over, making it obvious that this mode is way too short. There are 7 different areas, 14 stages total if you play on hard mode. So where does the gameplay start going downhill? As soon as you start having more enemies to deal with. This starts happening after the second area of stages. By this point, the game starts spawning ghosts right in front of you pretty consistently, giving the player little warning. Unfortunately, if you're armed with anything thrown like a rock or torch and you're really close to a ghost as it's spawning, this game has a tendency to eat your inputs at the worst possible time. You think you're throwing a rock up close and then nothing happens and you take a hit. This happened to me a lot as I was learning this game. And this doesn't necessarily happen in other action platformers. This doesn't happen in Mega Man, for example. You can point blank certain enemies without problems in those games. The great irony is that this problem makes the knife arguably more useful in many portions of the stages, just because the knife never suffers from this problem. If you have a ranged weapon, you'll have to move backwards a bit to give yourself room after something spawns in front of you, or you risk taking damage. And you can't go without the rocks for the boss fight, so you do need them. But that is not the only way the input eating occurs in this game. Sometimes when you try to jump down from a ledge by pressing down and A, you don't go down at all. You have to do the input again sometimes just to make it go through. But the thing is, you need to do this sometimes from moving platforms in order to avoid touching spikes. For the first example of input eating, I think the animation for throwing items takes too long once an enemy is at close range. So the game just says screw it and turns you into a sitting duck instead of trying to process the input. As far as jumping down from a ledge goes, I think that just comes down to bad programming at the end of the day. Regardless, it's a big problem. Speaking of bad programming, it's pretty clear to me that Probe Entertainment failed to work around the Game Boy's limitations properly. While I did compliment the graphical detail of this game earlier, they probably should have toned that down a little bit, as this game does have a bit of a choppy frame rate at times. However, a bigger problem is that everything is too big and too zoomed in. The Game Boy obviously had a tiny screen, whether it be the original model, the Pocket, or the Game Boy Color later on. Nintendo understood this when they designed the Super Mario Land games. Unfortunately, the folks at Probe did not get this at all. Here you end up with a game with a very limited perspective because everything is too big. Even the information at the bottom of the screen takes up too much space. The worst thing about all of this is that it creates a lot of blind jumps. It makes a simple jump like some of the ones on Nighttime 3 a nightmare to gauge, leading the player to take damage. There's another annoying one on the second half of Nighttime 4 that's quite notable. Oh, and there was a checkpoint in Nighttime 5 that I used to miss because I first assumed that there was nothing important on the other side of that blind jump. And there are also enemies that you have a hard time seeing ahead of you because of the limited perspective. On my first 1 credit clear of the game, I had a death on Nighttime 6 where I jumped upward off of a moving platform only to get hit by an enemy flying above that I couldn't see, which led me to get stunned and then land in a bottomless pit. Yeah, that sounds real fair, doesn't it? I've landed on top of enemies that I couldn't see below as well, and yes, I know that you can look up and down with the D-pad while standing still, but that in and of itself is awkward, and there's no way to look ahead of you to the left or right. Another thing that doesn't help is that the perspective doesn't stay centered on the player like a good platformer. You end up waiting a bit for the screen to catch up after you're done running, which is usually the sign of a badly designed game. Now, so far you might be thinking that input eating and blind jumps sound pretty bad. But wait, it gets much worse. This game managed to create a death loop of sorts that screws over players on hard mode in particular. But there's multiple things at work that come together to create such an unwinnable scenario. So first off, the time limits start working against you later on in the game. By the time you get to Area 5, the stages start getting a bit longer at this point, and of course, they're harder, so you're more likely to get hit and die, losing more time. Nighttime 5 makes players waste time deliberately at one point by having them break a bunch of blocks near the end of it, which causes the player to lose at least 10 to 12 seconds of valuable time right there. But wait, it gets worse. If you die, you stay on the same timer as before. If you run out of time after that, not only do you die again, but you only get a little less than a minute with the next timer, which is a big middle finger to the player. Not cool at all. Make it consistent, make it make sense, and most important of all, make it fair. Not only do some of these stages like Nighttime 5 get lengthier, the bosses also take longer to kill because they're much spongier. The last 3 bosses are all much spongier than the first 4 bosses. Because of that, you have to take advantage of an unexplained mechanic. This mechanic involves you finding a secret area in the daytime stage in order to find an individual who I believe is Van Helsing from the movie, who then gives you the triple rocks for the boss fight in the following nighttime stage. Now, none of that is explained in-game, and while I couldn't find the Game Boy version's manual online, I did find the NES version's manual, which is practically the same game in a lot of ways. Even that manual does not mention it, even though both versions were developed by the same studio. For the first 4 bosses, you won't need that power boost because the stages at that point are not very long and the bosses aren't too spongy either. However, you do need the triple rocks in order to not run out of time trying to kill the last 3 bosses. So we have longer stages and spongier bosses, but where is this problem most likely to occur? Nighttime 5. This is the longest stage in the game with a lot of annoying gotcha moments, and it tries deliberately to waste your time. It has one checkpoint that is extremely easy to miss because of the limited field of view as mentioned earlier. The boss here is not only spongy but also throws bats in the way to shield it from further damage, and it takes a little while for it to pop back up. So what happened to me a couple of times was I forgot to find Van Helsing in Daytime 5 prior, so when I got to Nighttime 5, I had about 1.5 minutes left once I got to the boss fight, and when I was fighting him, I only got the single rock instead of the triple rock, which is almost useless in this scenario. I would run out of time and then I'd get a new timer with less than 1 minute, way less than I had before. If you die before the timer runs out, you respawn with whatever time was left on the timer, so then you die yet again. After dying enough times, you obviously run out of lives, but then there's another kick in the nuts. This game has no continues, or at least I wasn't able to with the US version I was playing. Maybe the European version allows it because I did see a Russian streamer use continues on hard mode before. But anyways, every time this happened, I had to start all the way from the very beginning. So I needed to 1 credit clear the game in order to beat it anyway. I know that sounded like a long story, but did any of that make any logical sense from a design standpoint? Absolutely not! In fact, this is one of the most infuriating things I've ever experienced in any game. I've seen input reading and RNG out the wazoo, Gradius Syndrome, QuickTime events, you name it, I've probably seen it. This may be worse than all of those things. If I was in charge of Probe Entertainment when this game was being developed and I found out about this, I would have fired whoever came up with this idea to screw over the player like this. Absolutely disrespectful nonsense to anyone who bought this game back in the early 90s, or at any time, and this problem was easily preventable by giving the player another full timer after the time runs out the first time around, and maybe making the 5th boss pop up quicker just to make sure players can beat it even with a lesser weapon, or even better, make the later bosses a bit less spongy. There are no excuses for this, especially when you force players to experience the entire game by playing it on hard mode instead of medium or easy in order to get the real ending. Other games do not do this kind of nonsense. The Mario games never did this. If you ran out of time in, let's say, Super Mario Bros. 3, you got a full timer again once you ran out of time on the previous attempt. Also, unlike in this game, the items would also come back. And I didn't even get to mention that this game stole the item blocks from Super Mario Bros., but managed to screw it up by having the items always float upwards, so in some cases, they float away a bit too fast for you to pick them up. Yet another stupid idea. One last thing that I want to get into is high-level play in terms of 1 credit clears and speedrunning. While I do have a lot of problems with this game, it can definitely be beaten on 1 credit. Everything is consistent in this game. There's no RNG to contend with here, so once you memorize where all of the enemies, items, and hidden areas are, you'll know exactly what to do eventually. However, the more interesting thing here to a lot of people is going to be speedrunning. This game in particular has a funny glitch that arguably broke this game in the speedrunning community. It's called the out-of-box glitch or OOB glitch. SmartAlec24, a speedrunner, explained it pretty well in his guide that he posted on speedrun.com. So whenever you run off of a ledge or box, the game thinks you're still on the ground while you're falling. So players are able to press down and A right as they land to go through the floor. Once you go through the floor, you can go left and eventually through the wall by tapping left and right in a very specific manner that would honestly be a nightmare to pull off on a real Game Boy. Eventually, you wrap around through the wall to the end of the map and you clear the stage. I recorded myself doing it a couple of times, but it's kind of a pain in the rear end to pull off, honestly. I'm still not quite sure of the rhythm needed to pull it off quickly, but it seems like you have to be very fast. And personally, I'm not a fan of glitches like this being a thing. I think it's just another example here of shoddy programming in a game that already has plenty of it. But anyways, that is going to be it for Bram Stoker's Dracula on Game Boy. I know I was harsh on this one, but it really could have been so much better. This could have been a solid movie-based game for once instead of another failed game that people forgot about quickly. Unfortunately, this one has too many problems, including that whole death loop that I talked about. But anyways, did you play this game back in the day, or did you play a different version? Like the games for the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis? If you think there's a much more aggravating Game Boy game out there, I'd love to hear from you as well. Let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching and I'll see you again soon.